Okay, so we can download notes and assignments. Let me make sure that I have caption. So today we're going to talk about defense in depth, right? Building security solutions that entail different components so that way we have overlapping protection for our system. And one of the areas that we're going to touch on is to look at the categories of security like physical, administration, and so on. Okay, now it is. Okay, so make sure we remember what defense in depth is because you will see it on your certification and also on final exam and the practice test. So it is the practice of implementing different layers. So when you're implementing security, you have to think about how you would configure, right? We talked about last time how we would be able to configure systems to have security. For example, I would set up firewall rules to block certain type of traffic, but I would also need to implement physical security, like protecting my server room, making sure locks are on the door, so that way people cannot physically destroy that system, right? And also destroy my security appliance like my firewall. So defense in depth is really about having layered protections in various areas for the same thing. So if you are configuring your system to protect your network, you have to physically protect your network. You also have to train the user to have more secure practices so that way your network is safe. So it is about having this layered security that's going to give you the overall protection in your system and your infrastructure. So there are 3 areas that you need to look at. One is to control diversity. That means that you're going to have very different areas there that would be different than something that they are not all the same. That's what I'm saying. So you're going to have different brands, different systems, different laptops. For example, if you're looking at school district, the students are using Chromebook, right? But the instructors, they might be using Windows-based type of PC or Windows laptop. Then you have administrators, they might have, iOS devices. Okay. So in an infrastructure, you're going to see different technology and different vendor and different type of hardware that you're going to come across. And it's very important that number one, we keep inventory of the type of technology we have to make sure that we have the supported solutions along with securing them. So when we look at the questions that are asked for our assignment today, it actually really to define what's defense in depth, right? And this could be your interview questions or certification questions. It is a way that we can implement layered protection that would include administration. So when we say administration, that means that the rules that we follow in the company for our employees. For example, right, we don't write down the password. That's part of administration. That's something that we learn as a practice, as a user inside the organization. The second area is going to be the logical side of the house, which is where IT and cybersecurity people can control. Configuration. We need to make sure that our system have appropriate settings. For example, you learned how to set up password policy last time, right? We would add those rules for complex passwords, password history, how many times are we going to require the user to have updated the password before they can recycle the password, right? So we have to start with What are we setting as rules inside the organization as a practice for everyone? Not just IT people, but for everyone. Let's say that we want to make sure that everybody has long password. So we're gonna follow that up with configuration with the IT, right? That's the second area. Whatever that you tell the people to do, you need to set control in your system to do that, right? Everything that you've set up as rules in the organization can be configured. Okay, so for example, I tell the people that we don't allow people to tailgate, meaning that we don't open the door and let other people in without the badge, right? So we want to make sure that we configure that. We want to have surveillance system. We want to make sure. So when a second person that's entering the building without a badge, it should notify us, right? So it should activate the surveillance system, and it should also track. So we will be able to capture that image on video surveillance, and then we will do facial recognition with that. So in high security surveillance area, this is what you would see. We would need to follow it up with the IT side. Then you have to have physical security. Make sure that you protect your system, because what good is it if you configure and then someone physically destroy your system, right? Or it could be an event that destroys your system, like fire, earthquake, storm, right? And then it could be human-made. So environmental type of threats can also jeopardize the physical area. Okay, so always follow up with administration, configuration, and physical security. Any question? So these are the control. The technical control, we have a lot of say in this area. For IT and security people, we can control most of this part, right? Outside of the costs and, new implementation, that's part of the decision going onward for scalability. Administration, you need to work with operational manager along with the business manager to make sure, and HR, right? So collaboratively, you would be able to control administration. And then the physical control. Some of this we can control through the technical area. I think if you're looking at prison system, right? Prison system, there's a lot of technical control. So, when you see an individual go through a door, right, they cannot open a second door until the first door is shut. And then when they let the prisoners out to the yard, right, and then when they come back, they might go through security screening. That means that metal detection to look for sharp weapons, along with looking at facial recognition. Sometimes some prison systems would be more advanced. They would use fingerprinting, right? So a lot of this is to really physically track the prisoner, but also to do additional surveillance scanning. So with that, you would see that there's technical implementation that would align directly with the administrative, and then also the physical control, right? And that's a really good example for how all of these things are aligned. But if you're looking at facial recognition, how can they do that, right? So when you check in a prisoner, the first thing that they would do is they would take a photo of that prisoner, right? And then give them an ID. So that goes into a database, and that allows us to create a template of facial recognition, because in a template, you have to take the photo at least 5 to 10 times, right? You guys ever do template for your fingerprint or your face on your phone? It needs to take your picture at a different angle, so it would do a mathematical measurement of forehead, nose bridge, right? The mouth, the chin, how wide is the face, and so on. So even if this person changed over time, right, like having gray hair or, shave off their mustache, it should still be able to recognize this individual. So you would see that the technical implementation and administration and the physical controls are aligned. Okay, any question? Okay, so coming back here, right? And you can grab some of these for the next question. So in physical security, we look at perimeter. How can we protect the property or the building or the land or even the physical room where all our systems are housed? So when you're looking at something like internet service provider, AT&T, or even mobile companies like T-Mobile, Verizon, their physical security expands from central offices to the corporate offices and all the landline that they own. Okay, so communication company own tunnels that runs cable. So with that, you have to really protect the perimeter. Like, how can someone crawl into the tunnel and cut all my fiber cable, right? That would disrupt the business. Or even having gates, security guards, barricades, things that would also represent protection for your network. So I had students in my ethical hacking class, we were talking about wireless signal and how this is important as far as shielding or not shielding. So barricades sometimes can also represented with glass walls, metal plates in your walls that would protect signal from escaping the building, or you can have directional antenna physically pointing in certain direction. So physical security can go in various areas outside of just having security guards and gates and protections and locks. But you also, the deterrence part, I think, is to having cameras. And then if you're looking at more military based or industrial based, now I think we start to see more drone based type of surveillance or detection or protection, right? Drones can be equipped with weapon. Drones can also be equipped with camera. And with that, we will be able to see the perimeter a little bit better. So if you're looking at the military, that's more in that area, right? Buildings, lighting, video, surveillance, alarm system. I think also very important for like fire extinguisher and fire suppression system is very important for the physical building. And then for restriction of access and classified staff, or even in some sensitive area, this is very important for IT. I think that we can do a lot in how we allow access, right? Like you can look at smart card system, biometrics, retina scan, facial recognition to really secure and protect the physical area. Okay. Then you gotta protect your server, your network, where your cable goes. So you notice when you walk into this room, right, all the cable goes into the wall and then those cable goes into a switch. But you notice that you cannot see the switch. The only attack that you can probably do physically for this segment is to unplug the cable, right? But in an area where you see a lot of switches and if it's accessible, right, someone can pull the switch. So if I really want to disable your surveillance camera, what do? I just pull the power, right? Cut your power source, cut your network system. So a lot of times you would hide your network cable where it goes to the central switch. And then you also hide the power connection here because, it's a computer lab type of environment. You would see that, but a lot of the times they would run the cables very neatly. So it is really hard for you to unplug things because ideally, we don't want someone to go and tamper with power or network connection. Okay, so that means that we have to have air gaps. So normally you would see air gaps with the ceiling or the floor, right? So raised floor, normally they would give it a couple of feet and then run all the cable, like the power and the network cable underneath. And then some companies, they would run it through the ceiling. Now, with that, we have to look for like fire hazard and also, interference with signals. So when you have a lot of cables combined in an area, you're gonna have a lot of interference because every electronic device has some kind of emission. And when you're using something like Ethernet type of cable, or even the best one is the fiber optic because it's light based, so it doesn't have a lot of interference or at all, and it doesn't leak that much. But you are gonna have some kind of emission even for the wireless area. So you really have to look at how you would be able to protect that, right? So I talked to my ethical hacking students. There are ways to really sniff out signal that is even, for wavelength, right? Not even wireless signal, but in a network. I've seen devices that are made that does kind of like X-ray scan, so they can be in the next room and they would run that device. And what it does is it sends electrical signal. So you know that when it hits a physical surface, it bounces back. And when the signal bounces back, it's able to create an image of what it is in that room, right? This has been done before. So it would map out some of the electrical devices or even visually give you a blur image of what would be in the next room. So we want to be able to shield some of that signal electronically, and we want to be able to block that. And so your barricades could mean that you can have fountain, you can have glass wall, you can have metal plate wall, or sometimes brick wall works really well in bouncing signal. And then to be able to protect, right? We want to have fire safe lock cabinets, servers, equipments, but having lock on your server doors and server rooms is essential. Simply that, right? Having air gap. So in the next question, you can simply pick any of the three, right? So what I did was I kind of picked some of the three areas for the three physical control. You can have security guards. I think having the security guards around the area, it really have more of a deterrence effect. And then also surveillance camera does the same thing, right? Are we gonna be able to stop something from happening? Likely not, because a lot of the security guards don't have, they're trained not to, attack back or having some kind of weapons. But it costs the people to think twice about committing a crime if they're security guards. So it is somewhat effective. Having lock on your doors, you can put down gates, surveillance system, having air gap space, like ceiling space. We can run the cable through that or even floor space. And the list would go on. So when you are developing a security plan for a business, you have to have these things. So I would have a checklist and I would go through that checklist, right? You would start with checking for locks on doors, having some kind of surveillance system, having enough lighting. That's also very important. And then you can also have man trap. You see this at hotels all the time, the spinning door, right? Or when you go to an amusement park, you would see the turnstile wheel. So it allows only one person at a time, and you have to scan your wristband or your little card to be able to enter the amusement park or a ball game, right? That actually is a type of man trap to make sure that you don't have multiple people entering at once. And then you want to slow down that process, right? I talk about security is all about slowing things down and making sure that we double check, okay? And then you can have detection type of sensor. So this is more alarm-based system, noise detection, motion detection, temperature detection, and then proximity reader. So now the downside of this is the attacker can do the same thing, right? They can build readers to be able to read signal for your access card, especially if you're using NFC, right? Near field communication type of system, like what you see with credit card. And so chip-based send out signal and so on. So fire suppression, ultimately, when you're implementing this type of system, when you come into a company, likely they already have that, right? That's part of the building and it's part of fire code that they have to have some kind of system. If you're looking at warehouses or all the way to like tall rise building, They have to have exit evacuation type of exit. You have to have fire suppression. A lot of the time it's water-based. And water-based is kind of bad news for us because if the system is on, water comes down, likely that you're going to have short on the system. You don't really see oxygen suppression type of, because fire needs oxygen to survive. And previously they have like halon type of system or other type of gas-based system. But that is what they would use that when the human is completely evacuated, right? You rarely see that type of system because it's not human friendly. Okay. So we need to really think about how we would remove the heat, remove the fuel for the fire, and then stop it from spreading. So ultimately, if it's electrical fire, it's different than what you would see with gas-based fire or oil-based fire. So you have to really talk to facility in order to build out this part of your security plan, right? Any question? Okay. So we talked about how cables can be cut, cables can be damaged, cable can emit interference. But you can also block signal by using different type of tools. We can use feather cage to block like wireless signal to create a shield. And you see this at concert or stadium. They do that so that way you're not streaming live, right? Some in case that they sell subscription or they don't want certain type of data leak from the live show. So feather cage really create a wireless shield for the signal to prevent external signal from coming in. And in some cases, I can reverse that, having internal signal. And so if you're looking at something like a hospital, if you're looking at X-ray equipment or MRI machines, those type of machines need to be completely not interrupted by other signal-based type of system. So normally we would want to set up where our wireless signal is not going to leak to that area. And so when the patient is escorted in that room is completely used for X-ray type of waves. That is because if you're looking at, the spectrum for the radio frequency, X-ray is pretty high up there. And then you have the lower signal, which is going to be wireless. But when you have a lot of signal or an amplification of signal, it can cause those machines to be misreading the signal. So in that case, you want to make sure that you have separation of those waves or those radio frequency from bleeding into certain area that is sensitive. So when you set that up, you have to think about what kind of equipment we're using, along with what kind of network type of systems that we're using to make sure that we have communication. So blockage sometimes can be internally required, and then also it gives you protection. And you would use battery. So sensors, we mentioned that we can use motion detection. I'm sure you've seen this for home alarm system, right? If I activated the alarm, someone entered, and if they're moving, right, from the front door to the back hall, they would, to deactivate the alarm, they might have, 50 seconds or a minute, depending on the setting. And then otherwise it's gonna sound up. But with that, we would implement sensor. Now, you can implement motion sensor in certain area of, let's say that the data center, so that way you can track like who's accessing that particular area. If it's a very sensitive area, we want to make sure that we detect that in case, because human, we're gonna have to walk to it or run to it. So motion detection is probably a good way to detect who's down that aisles or who's in that part of the hall. And then you have noise detection. So if you watch like all the greatest theft in history, right, of arts, you see all of these museums, they implement a lot of physical security, noise detection, motion detection, and temperature detection. I'm sure you've seen this in some of the famous movies, right? Because for temperature, it really in our server environment, you're gonna see that our system likes it cool. Not only that, human has a certain temperature, right? And then moisture detection is very important because that prevent our system from rusting or deteriorating. Cable rusts, right? Because it uses copper. And so if you have a lot of moisture in the area, so if you operate in the area that has a lot of humidity, like Florida, and some area that has a lot of rain, moisture detection is important. Okay. And then temperature also protect your system from shutting down or crashing, right? So when it gets to a certain temperature, we want to make sure that we have the proper HVAC kicks in. You guys hear about the Target hack from a long time ago, right? How did they get in? Through HVAC system. So all of those are centrally controlled through our infrastructure. So all of these things are normally implemented for just external and internal protection. Okay, so let's talk about some physical attacks. These are really interesting. We disable the USB connection from the front, and likely that you have to enable the back panel of the PC because you need to attach mouse and keyboard or even wireless adapter for your IO devices. Now, Ninja USB, some people can use this to be able to install some kind of malware to be able to read keys that are typed, so you can add keylogger. Rubber ducky is often very common. You see that from Hack5, but that's called a Ninja USB. So someone can walk by, plug a USB onto your system, and be able to install something or run something, right? Or download a file automatically. Then you have malicious flash drive, kind of like the same thing, but just make sure that the users are aware of it. People pick up USB and they plug things in all the time. And then we simply, on the IT side, if we tell the user they cannot plug in unknown USB, you need to follow it up with settings. So where can I go to disable my USB connection? I think most of you took 25 or currently is in CIS25. Where do I go to disable USB connection? Where? Where is it? In control panel. What about BIOS? Basic input output system, right? And then on the Windows side, you can use UEFI to go into the settings of it. In control panel, you can look at device manager that gives you what is allowed and what's not allowed. So that's a good start, is to look at, right? So you can search device manager on the Windows environment, but BIOS is going to allow you to turn a certain port on and off physically, right? So even if I have the back ones on, because on the front panel, it might have what, 4 USB ports. So you can turn that off in BIOS. So you can select which USB that you want on or off, disable and enable. You can logically configure that. Yes, that's true, through device manager. Right click the device and then, that's if it's attached, or turn off your universal serial. That would disable front and back on the OS side, right? But sometimes they plug it in and it doesn't even need to start, right? They can corrupt your boot or your OS by just attaching that USB, press the start button, and before it even load the OS, it will kill your boot sector or it would corrupt it with some kind of malware. So if you turn it on or turn it off through BIOS, right? It would disable the physical port for USB. And then here it talks about card skimming. This is often done with ATM machine. You probably seen those. It's an attached device that goes to like a gas station pay kiosk, or you would see it as those little ATM. Now, I think the bank is doing a better job with detecting those. So if it has been manipulated or tampered with, the ATM machine actually sends the network some notification and then they disable the ATM machine. The ATM machine is just a computer system. It's a terminal that has certain menu and buttons, right, to select. So, and then they would use that to do card cloning. Card cloning is pretty easily done. A lot of the times they use a blank Visa or a type of credit card, and then they would program those cards, or if it has a chip, they would modify the information on that chip. So I think having a chip is a little bit more secure, but there's still cards that are being cloned. So ultimately, when they're doing skimming, they're basically using the information that they skim to be cloning a new card or a card that they could use, like your bank card, and transfer that onto a card that they buy from a pack and then modify it. So that's how they can withdraw the money, right? And if they're physically going to the bank, they have to show the ID. So it is easier to do an ATM attack with card skimming and card cloning. But it is a little harder nowadays, but I think our ATM systems is a little better at notifying for security breach. Okay, so let's go through the next few questions. So 6 asks you, explain why cable distribution is an important aspect of the physical security. It's because when the cable is damaged, the communication and the operation is interrupted. So when you don't have cable connection, you don't have communication. So for example, if the cable is cut for a retail store, likely they won't be able to process transaction. Most of the sales terminal now, right? It's computerized, so a lot of the time you have to override it to access the cash drawer. Imagine most people don't have cash on hand, so they might not be able to pay in cash only, right? So you would lose customer that. If they cut the cable communication, business simply just shut down gradually or right away. So cable distribution is very important. We must protect the physical connection. And I really think that power is the core in everything. Even if you have communication, if your power is removed, done, right? So backup power, we have to have a UPS, uninterrupted power supply, a generator, or some form of backup power. I think for California now, I think a lot of the companies are able to use solar-based type of power backup system with battery, right? With the battery, we're gonna make sure that the battery is operable, just like the UPS. Battery would expire after a certain time, and then we have to replace it. And then we talked about card skimming and ATM attack. So how can you tell, right? How can an individual detect card skimming device on an ATM machine? There is a seal that's placed on there. If you look at the credit card reader, when you're inserting your card, especially when it has an attachment, if it's loose, likely that it has been tampered with. And if the card reader extends past the panel, I think all the newer ATM, you see that it's equipped into the panel. It's not protruding on the outside like the old ATM machine, but you do still see some old ATM machine being used, especially outside of the United States, right? You have to be really careful of using your credit card outside of the United States, because maybe those, the country, it depends on the bank system. If they don't control the ATM machines, likely, right, that they're not going to have security on the ATM machine. It took us a while to get here. I think our ATM system is a lot better. But you just look for these signs. So the next time you pay for gas or taking out money, especially at those small little ATM machines, inside like a liquor store or a convenience store, just pay attention to the actual machine. A lot of the smaller machine would have like, it looks like a round ball in the front and it's green, right? Or blue. Those are like additional attachment, but if it's protruding, if you see if they added something, it will be extended above that. So it will be right behind it and it's bolted on. So they can simply remove it real quick, attach it. And then so when you insert your card is actually read, especially on the older card where it has the number engraved. And then it sends that to their server and that's how they're able to do identity theft through credit card. Okay. Any question? So, did I go too far down? Okay. So let's talk about asset management, which is the next part. We need to make sure that we track assets, especially our systems. Okay. So when you first get the computer or the security appliance and all of that, you would start with the asset tracking process. If you look in the back of your monitor, you can turn around and look or even see right here, right? This is what they use, is they normally use a scanner type of sticker like this. It allows RCCD to track all the inventory that a lot of the time, anything that's over $500 is considered an asset, right? So they would, when you receive your equipment, you would track it by a certain ID. Now, if my company is small and I don't have this kind of system, I simply give it a number, right? Create an Excel spreadsheet, put down the model number, the vendor information. So if this is an Alienware, right, you would put down its model number. So the monitor is separate than the tower because the tower itself is, when we purchased it, was about $2,700. So, you know, you would then put down the details because that's going to help you with support and also physical security. Inventory is really, really important because you have to be able to make sure that you look at the flaws in the system in security. And so that's what we start with, is an inventory list. Hardware tracking. You also have to do software tracking, right? The licenses and to manage software. But we would look at the depreciation in the system. So normally they would retire that after 5 years, or with extended use, it might be shorter. Okay. Now, system sprawl is just a term that they would have excess inventory. They would have more than what they need. But if you don't document your assets, people can steal it, right? System can be jeopardized. I read a case a long time ago that the White House was attacked, and it was through the library system that has an analog phone connection. On the way to work today, I was listening to NPR, and they were talking about, you know, a quarter of adults that live in the United States still own landlines, right? But the company, the communication company, actually want to just get rid of them because now mostly everybody uses mobile platform, or, you know, going fiber optics. They don't use the analog phone anymore. But people still have the old alarm system, or they prefer to use landline with analog signal. Now, with that, when we look at that, we would see, okay, that might be an area or a weakness in our network where we have an analog line that's connected. And so the attacker, how they were able to reach some part of the White House system was through an analog landline that was connecting to a library system for backup purposes. So it was implemented a long time ago, as they thought that it might be a backup line in case everything else failed. But they don't monitor it. And so when you don't monitor your assets and your resources, what will happen is someone would look into that and then use that to attack your network. So having that kind of additional resources, you gotta make sure that you monitor it. So the importance of asset management is the area that you need to look at is to make sure that we implemented processes to protect company investment, because ultimately it comes down to the dollar. So what tasks do we need to do to make sure that we protect the investment? So from the IT side, start with asset tracking, right? And then start with using security software. Start with having training people how to log in for their system, and then make sure they lock their screen or they lock their system when they leave. Stuff like that. So you need to really document the procedures. Those are step by step to be able to accomplish security processes for the organization. Okay. So when they don't document the system, and you might be that specialist or the analyst that comes in, right? And you clean up the areas that they have. Usually people hire security people for the lack of. So this is where we talk about like how sometime attacker would look at the job description and then they would know what's wrong with that company. A lot of times you're going to come in, you're going to fix the problem. So if they don't document your system, you need to implement a purchase tracking process. Okay. And you need to make sure that for each of these things, purchase come in, it goes through inventory, and it goes through tracking for assets. I had to clean up someone's infrastructure a year ago through this process. Their IT manager is old school. He writes everything down on a pen, and it's really hard to be able to streamline the process when other people are receiving equipments and things like that. So we have to implement a way that we can centralize all of this, okay? And then you have to train people on how to do better. Okay, so let's talk about environmental impact. So some of the environmental control, we talked about power system already, but HVAC is very important. That's going to give you cooling, temperature control. We can implement fire suppression. Companies also implement like, earthquake type of equipment for the building or even in the data center or the server room. So for example, if I have racks like that in the back, right, I want to make sure that I have mounted in a way that in the case that I have earthquake, it doesn't fall down and hurt people and also damage the equipment. So you would see something like that. Having a generator or UPS, uninterrupted power supply, that's simply a large battery that you can connect your system to in case, like your servers, your critical servers, in case your power goes out, it will kick in, right? So I tell a lot of the security people and even the network administrator, having a UPS there, and if you don't test your UPS, it's no good. I have a friend, he was telling me that he had this UPS for 3 years. They paid like lots of money for it. He attached it, he connects it all the time. He assumed that it worked. And then one day power went out and it didn't work. Because battery dies, right? Sometimes when you buy the equipment, don't assume that it's brand new. It took a while for it to get to the store, and then they might have it on shelf for a long time or in their warehouse for a while. So it might have already been there for a few years. And then once it hits your facility, and if you don't test it or check it, right? Most of these would have software that you can monitor. So, but don't rely on UPS for hours of use, right? Normally, we would have a UPS. At most, it will be a couple of hours. And some smaller UPS, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, just enough for you to pull some data that's important or turn on the other server in another location. So your failover system, so that way everything is seamless. Okay, so having that backup power for a short time. Now, if you have a generator that lasts a little longer, if it's gas-based generator, you gotta make sure that you give it fuel and you gotta check it, right? But there are different type of generator that's used. Sometimes facilities, they would share generator with buildings. It depends for the business. I saw the Facebook documentary a while back. They use water-based generator, which is really interesting. It pulls some of the moisture from, you know, like the HVAC system, and then it recycled that and it reconverted it into power base. So you do see a lot of generator now that's coming out that's more green. It's water-based type of electrical system, which is cool. And then, well, it depends. I think that was the Oregon location. And then if you go into like other data center around the world for Facebook, they might use different type. So it really depends on, you know, also the building itself, how, you know, the technology that they use, but they invested a lot of money. Meta invested a lot of money in protecting their data center because that's money, right? That's money for Facebook. So for Meta. So I think for most of you now, as you're entering the field, you're gonna see a lot of really cool technology that's being used, especially green-based technology. And I think if we're looking back about 10, 20 years from now, we're gonna see, yeah, still gonna have battery. Yes, we're still gonna have some of the older technology, but I think that we are doing things a little bit better as far as the environment goes. Okay. So in the next part, it's gonna go into network interface card. Your NIC is your network interface card. And having the redundancy for network interface card for connection in network operation is important. When you're setting up your network system, and you will see some of this down the line when we set up your server, you have an option to set up NIC teaming. Most server system would have multiple adapter, usually at least 2, right, in the tower or on the server that would go on the rack, because the server would receive a lot of requests. And so if you're using only one network interface part, one network adapter, it's gonna have a lot of bottleneck. So the server motherboard would come with multiple NIC. And so what we can do is we can logically set up NIC teaming. Hi. This is a way that we remove single point failure in the system. So when I say single point failure, it just means that if you only have that one way in and that one way out, if that one way is gone, right, you have no connection. So if you have multiple ways in and out, like we have an emergency exit, a main entrance, and a different exit, we might be able to evacuate, right? So same thing with your system. If it has multiple ways to communicate through multiple network adapter, then we are going to remove the SPF, single point failure. It's going to also allow the system to communicate better. That means that it's going to be more available to communicate. So your throughput is better. And we would reduce failure and disruption. Because if one doesn't handle it, the other one can, right? That's assuming if we have 2. But if you have more than 2 adapter, right, you would be able to diversify the workload for each adapter. So this is what's called NIC teaming. And this is an option that you would see with server OSs as well when you set it up. And you can also go in and change the NIC adapter configuration for that particular system. Okay, so we're gonna do a little backup today. I really feel that it's important. Backup might seem very simple, right? but it might be your job and it's not bad, right? I did it for a while. It's not bad. So backup is part of having redundant data. So the older system that would be used, and some of you would be able to set this up on your, either at home, right? You can buy discs that are RAID, and we need to know RAID for A+. We need to know RAID for a lot of these type of certification, because even though it's old technology. So RAID stands for redundant array. What is that? Inexpensive disk. Redundant array of inexpensive disk. You have RAID level 0, and RAID level 0 requires 2 drives. Those are hard drives. Okay? When it writes, it's gonna go back and forth the fastest it can. Just let's think about, like, you need to get from here to home, and you have 2 lanes to drive on. Nobody's on those lanes. You can go one side or the other, right? But if there's a car on the left lane, you go to the right lane. And so that's how RAID 0 is. It's striped. It's striped from the top disk and the right disk. And so it just goes where it's the next available slot is. But you need to have 2. Okay. However, if one fails, the other one doesn't have the entire data, does it? Because if I write to 1 and 2, right, let's say I put 50% here and 50% here, in order to have the entire data, I have to have both disks to read, right? Now, RAID 1 uses 2 disks. It does a copy. So whatever I write on the 1, I make a duplicate on the 2. But it's only 50% capacity because it's exact duplicate, right? So if I have a terabyte here and a terabyte here, the terabyte of data here is exactly the same thing as a terabyte here. It's not 2 terabytes, it's just 1. Okay. Now you have 3, 5, 6 is they do stripe, and some of them duplicates, but they require 3+ disks. So when they say an array of disks, just means it's a group of disks starting with at least 2. So that way you can have data that is backed up, right? So for example, if you're looking at something like Atlanta Airlines, okay? Atlanta Airport has a lot of different airlines that would fly in and out. You might have Delta, you might have all these airlines, but how do they control, right, all of these? So their system really navigate like who comes in, who comes out, flight schedule based on the airlines that work for that airport. If they don't back up that data, what will happen is if their data get corrupted, the whole airport shut down, don't you think? Right? Who's gonna know which airline comes in at which time and then which takes off? And so how do they coordinate flights? Same thing with a lot of our transportation system. So for the critical system, you often see, and this doesn't have to be exactly like that, RAID 10. So when we say 10, there's no level 10. It's RAID 1 and 0. Meaning that I'm going to duplicate my data and stripe. Okay. Striping is going to give me fast for RAID 0, and duplicate data, I have redundancy. Okay. So if I lose one drive, my other drive has the data. Whereas RAID 0, if I lose one drive, I don't have the entire data because it writes 50%, right? So if you want fast and redundancy, you would go for RAID 10. And this is just industry practice. Everybody chooses this. If you look up RAID, some people, they would do 5 and things like that where it's striped, but you have more disks, so it costs more. So for RAID 10, you just need, right, at least 2 disks. So when you set this up, this is going to be a backup server. You would have to have at least multiple drives. And then when you send your backup, you just send it to that, and then you catalog your backup. Back in the day, we would write it to the drive, take the drive out, and sends it off to a company that stores it. Now we just ship it to the cloud, right? Another server that we rent, and it's there. you can pull your backup as long as you have internet. So the problem with that is when you hit with tornado or earthquake, when you have no communication, you would rely on satellite, and satellite is very slow. Okay, a lot of the time we use backup communication in satellite because if physically something's wrong with the earth, right, we can go to the orbit, but it is very slow. Okay, and then when it's cloudy, you get no signal. If you have satellite TV, you probably had the problem before. Okay, so here it talks about environmental control, fault tolerance with nick teaming, reducing single point failure. That's very important. There's your redundant array of inexpensive disks for A+. Make sure you guys remember this. Right, it's randomly generating question. You might not get array questions, but likely it's still there because we still teach it in every single security area. There's still companies using this. Okay. And then cloud server system might be using some of the old technology as well. Okay, so we talked about RAID. And then let's touch on backup. So backup, usually we take a snapshot of the system, right, and its data at a point of time. So let's say that at midnight tonight, I'm going to back up the entire server. That means its operating system, right? All the accounts on it, all the configuration that it has, and then all its data. Let's say files. I would then perform a full backup. You would always start with a full backup. Your system state and its content. Understand? Now we can do an offline backup. This is when your system is not operational. So let's say my company opens from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. 9 a.m. in the morning to 11 p.m. at night. Right? Let's say that I own a small store. At 12, at midnight, I'm going to back up all the transactional information, all the receipts, all the records, all the things that happen, all the shift, all the people who come into work, and so that way I have some kind of data in case my system go wrong. When you're not using that system and you're doing the backup, it's called offline. And then you can also do an online backup. It's performed while the system is running. This tends to be more resource intensive, of course, right? But in the case where you have 24/7 type of business like e-commerce, like Amazon, they do online backup. And more very frequent because, and you have backup of a backup, right? If you're looking at social media company, if you delete your account, right, and you come back later trying to revive your account, it's still there. They can pull your account because there's system that back up another system, right? Multiple times, 10 times, 12 times, 100 times over. Because in the case where there's legal aspect and data, right? Access and user accounts, and then there's also redundancy for data to make sure that your data is available when it's needed. So your data retention, really rely on, right, not having a single point failure, having redundancy, and making sure that you have backup. Okay, so with that, number 15. If you have a small local store, opens from 9 to 9 on Monday through Sunday, how do you do a backup? Okay, you would start with a full backup. So like I mentioned before, a full backup contains OS, configurations, all of the things along with files. So when you do a backup at home, when you select all of those things, it takes a snapshot of your system, what your system contains, and put it into a backup file. Now, you can't just double click that backup file and pull up your file in case your system is corrupted. It doesn't work that way, right? If you have gone through the restore of a PC, you know how painful that is. Okay. If it takes you 4 hours to back up your computer, assume that it takes twice as long to restore if you're successful. Windows environment sometimes is sketchy, right? So we are gonna do a full backup of the system. And I would do that offline. You see that at 10 p.m. Because number one, it is a small business. It does shut down at some point. So when you do an offline backup, usually that's faster. It doesn't require a lot of resource because it's reading and writing at the same time to this. So the processor is gonna do twice the load. Understand? So when you're doing a backup of something that's more free, it's gonna take all of the thing and just writing it instead of just reading and writing and reading and writing. So when you keep updating the data, it has to look for the changes all the time. So we're gonna do a full backup on Sunday. Okay. So let's say that this is my first week of opening. Okay. The downside of this is I waited a week to do a backup. If my system crashed somewhere in that mid-week, I'm done. Okay. But based on this scenario, you can start your full backup the next day, Tuesday. So the way that I did this was just to make it easy for you to understand. So let's say that we open on that Sunday, right? That's our grand opening, 9 a.m. At the end of that Sunday night, we're gonna do a full backup. So you have a 1 day's worth of data. Then after that, we are going to do a differential for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So differential just means that what is modified. So when you do a backup, it changes the attribute of the file to a /A in Windows system. What that tells the OS is that this file has been archived to backup. Once that happens, it's gonna, if I go in and I modify that file, it's gonna look at the differences from the time that it's archived until the time that I modified it. It's gonna take a capture of that and add it to the differential. So in order to replace the file as its entirety with its update, I need to pull from the original full backup, which is where it archived on Sunday, and I added the Monday and the Tuesday and so on. So if my system crashed on Thursday, I have to pull the full backup on Sunday, pull the differential subsequently until the Thursday, right? Now, if you do an incremental backup, you just do a full pull from the Sunday and pull the incremental on a Wednesday because the incremental builds up on the differences from the prior day. Okay. You guys understand that? So the differential is the differences from day to day each time, right? And you see that with the lab today. And then the incremental, it's an increment that's built. So when I'm doing the incremental, I have to pull the full always for both, the full. And then for the incremental, it's gonna be the previous day. So if my system crashed midday on Thursday, I lost the morning, but I will have the Wednesday data intact from the full backup and the incremental on Wednesday. Okay. Now, like I said before, restore take time. You would always, we're gonna do the calculation for the security because we have to calculate the amount of time that it takes you to restore your system back to normal from the time that it crashed. So we have to predict all of that. Okay. So now if you do the differential, we have to pull it each day, right? So if you have a lot of changes Monday to the day that it crashes, like let's say Friday, it takes a long time. So it really depends on the schematic, but you have to pull the full. Okay. Any question? So now how often do they do the full? It really depends, right? A lot of the time they cycle through. For me, periodically, when I did this, every few months we would do a full again just to make sure that we double check. But a lot of the time you build on the full, and then because it defeats the purpose of having to do a full every day. That takes too much work. You just added the differences for the subsequent day. Okay. Okay. So when you back up, you also need to protect your media. If you back it up to a drive, some people do it onto a USB, right? Protect your drive. Put it in a fire safe cabinet, send it out. There are companies that would come down with the armor truck to pick it up if you have very sensitive data. Or now we send it to the cloud. So the only important part is when you send your backup to your cloud server, you got to make sure that you protect that server. So security needs to be implemented, and also your transmission of that backup file or the data needs to be secured as well. So you have to use encryption for that transmission of your data. Always test your backup periodically. So make it a practice. You can do this weekly. So how do I test? I can fire up the virtual machine or have another system and go through the restore process to see if it works. If the data is going to be placed back, how long did it take me? And every time that you do that, you can use a simulated environment, or you can use a real environment, a test system that is isolated. You can set that up and check. And that's how you can tell. Theoretically, a lot of times people say, oh, it takes 8 hours to back up, 8 hours to restore. That's not true. Okay, I'm going to tell you experience-wise, you have to have buffer time. Because things can go wrong. If you go through Windows Restore, you already know. Sometimes it doesn't. When it's almost done and then it stopped working or it crashes again, you have to go through it again. Okay. So I wanted you to look up a network attached storage, NAS. That is different than SAN. Simply, this is a system or a drive type of system. It's like a computer in some model. But a lot of the times it could just be like a storage device that you can connect to your network. So if a small business requires 10 terabyte of storage, you can simply search for that. So open up your Google. And then you just look up network attached storage. And then we need 10 TB. Now, if we want to scale it out, we can go more, but 10 terabyte is quite a bit for now, right? Let's say that. So you do have variation in the pricing. And some of them have different feature. So if you're looking at something like this is something more for like home use. You can access it remotely or via the internet. And then if you want to go, so for a larger business, I would go with something that is rack mounted or something that is, you want to kind of uniform some of the brand too. So if your storage server is a Dell, you want to stick with a Dell because support is better. But in some cases, that company might have gone out of business. You have to buy a different brand, then you want to make sure it is compatible. That's very, very important. Okay. So we do have a variation. It doesn't matter which one you pick, but I want you to look at the feature. Some are manageable, like the management console is a lot easier. The software tools that it has. And then this one just have more storage than what we need. And then also it gives you like the bay for the drive, you can add more. And then if we want to scale out more, you can also buy a drive and attach it to some of your existing storage system. But if we start from scratch, then you can go with something super powerful like this, $89,000. And then 10,000. So you do see, right? Like the variation in the equipment that some of them you're going to be mid-range, some of them is going to be very high range. But with that, you have processing power, RAM, because it is a computer, it is a server itself. And then management capability, software that's equipped with it. Some of them don't come with, a lot of extra features. So for a small business, we want to be reasonable with the price. Okay, so you can pick. So when you derive a solution like that, sometimes you have to provide the equipment information. So just give me a general description. You can pull it from the price page and then price before taxes, okay? All right, so earlier I mentioned that we have to compute or we have to calculate recovery time objective and the recovery point objective. So whenever that you see the PO, that's going to pertain to data storage. The recovery time objective is going to pertain to minutes and hours to recover. So RTO identifies the maximum amount of time to restore the system after the outage. Remember what I said, right? It might take you 8 hours to back up, more than 8 hours to restore, sometimes 12. So that will be the maximum time. Why do we need to report this? Because the downtime, right, is sometimes impact operation. So that means that we might lose customer, we might not have, proper business operation in the case of if we have to connect to vendor to supply us with things, if our system is down, we cannot do that. So if you're looking at the case like Caesar Palace, right? They had a downtime of at least a week. So the first couple of days, their websites start to working, but really slow. So the server, they had a maximum of 48 hours for their web server to come back up, right? And so those come back up first. Why? Why did they make a decision to put the web server back up? Because it's web front and it's world recognized, right? So everybody in the world can connect to Caesar.palace.com. And then you would see some of the other systems gradually come on. The casino computers, all of those gradually go on one section at a time. So somebody in security has to really have a plan on which system is going to go up first, restore first, and how long does that take? So within that 48 hours, doesn't matter what they do, even if it's a static page, right, to have a phone number to contact the front desk, they still have to put it up with an index file. So the recovery point objective is find a point in time where the data is lost. Remember what we talked about earlier, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? So if our system crashed on Friday morning, the recovery point is going to be Thursday backup, Thursday differential with the full. So the latest data that we backed up is on Thursday night, right? So that's the point, is your data at that time where you can pull. So Caesar Palace, they were breached and their system were down, right? We talked about the time, but let's say that their data was corrupted. So it will be the previous hour or the previous day or the previous backup in the point of data. That's where they're going to pull. So let's assume that they back up every hour. It's the hour before the crash is the point, okay? So where that data was backed up, that data that was backed up the hour before is the RPO. We're going to do an exercise next week. We're going to come up a plan. We're going to come up with a plan for our business with all of this information. Then you have to compute or predict the mean time between failures. This is the measurement of systems reliability that's represented by the average or the arithmetic mean between the failures. So let's say that your company have 3 failures in a year, right? Let's say that it fails every 4 months, which is quite often. Okay. So we want to compute the average. So how do I calculate the average? I add everything up and divide it by. So if I'm looking at the annual, if I'm looking at 4 month wise, right? So I know that it fails every 4 months. So we know that it's 3 times in a year. And let's say that we would compute, let's say in the 3-year span. So that means that it would be what? 3 times 3, that's 9. 9 divided by 3, so the average will be 3 every year, right? So it's the same. What if I have failure in 3 in the first year, 5 in the second year, and 6 in the following year? I would take 3 plus 5 plus 6 divided by 3. So 8 plus 6 is 14 divided by 3. It's gonna be like 3 point something, right? So that average or that mean is going to tell you the mean time between failure. So I know that it's going to be about every 4 months. So that means that it should be expected every 4 months. So I have to prepare for it. And then the mean time between the recover. So let's say that the first time I recover, it took me 48 hours. The second time I recover, it takes me 12 hours. The third time I recover, it takes me 10 hours. So you take 24 plus 12 plus 10 divided by 3, you get the average. So you would have an idea of what's the average recovery time for your company. Now it is the scenario, so you have to look at like system specific. So if let's say if we're looking at web server, you have to look at the average recovery time for that web server. How long did it take as an average time to recover or repair that system? Okay. This is going to come up again for many security certifications. So make sure we're familiar with the term. I know it's probably maybe the first time or you read about it before, but make sure we remember these things. A lot of acronyms. So now, depending on the type of company, recovery can mean a lot of different things. For us, in general, we would look at servers, we would look at system, could be user or endpoint systems. But for a telecommunication company like AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, they can use mobile type of recovery sites. So in general, when you recover, so let's say that Southern California had a huge earthquake. When we recover, we might have to go to another area in California or another state, right? You've probably seen news and story about storms and different environmental impact. So a telecommunication company, they started doing mobile-based recovery site. They put things on 18-wheeler truck and they're able to transport it. So if something is impacted, the reason why they do that is that way people would be able to have communication through satellite system, through mobile-based temporary networks. So when you have environmental impact, likely that you will lose your landline or even mobile tower. So they have to rebuild some of that onto something that they can transport. They would build something that would be mirror. So a mirror is going to be a duplicate of whatever that their site would be. So if you're looking at like an office that would have switches and routers and communication lines, they would have some of that mobile base or a duplicate of it. And then when you have a hot site, that means that it's just another location that has all the equipment, all the system running as the same original location. When you have a cold site, that's usually just empty building. So companies would have backup sites, recovery sites elsewhere in the world. So for something like California, I would consider, or even in some part of Mexico, or even Canada, right? You would see that the main hub might be on the West Coast, but their data might, or their recovery site might be on the East Coast or even in another country. So you would see now that we would see that a country might be impacted with war, a country might be impacted with environmental threats. So you would see that we would have, so for a company that would run hot sites, they would have the resource to do that, right? Equipment, people to maintain, and so on. I know this is long, but because it has a lot of like the recovery and the preparation and all of these planning component, so it's important. Lastly, why is DRP important in business? Disaster Recovery Plan. Because it contains step-by-step procedures. Those are things that people can follow in the case that it happened. The resources that are needed in the case of disaster occur. Like, you know how families are planning for earthquake, right? They would have containers for water, food supply, maybe a bag and in their car, right? With clothes and shoes and toilet paper and all of these things, or maybe in the garage. And they would tell all the family members, in case this happens, go here, get this, right? Call so and you can go to so-and-so house. So it's like that for business. You need to make sure that you have a procedure and you train the people on what to do. And because the business rely on DRP to recover. Statistically shown that the business who don't have a business plan and disaster recovery plan don't survive after a few years. So they rely on disaster recovery in case that happens. And when we're talking breach, attack, all of those things go into a DRP. Okay? All of the threats, all of those things we have to prepare for, not just, you know, fire and earthquake, but other things, human attacks. Okay. Any question? Okay, save your work. If you finish, you can upload it to Canvas. I'm gonna stop recording.